In this video, we're going to go over how to write conditionals in P5js. We also call conditionals if statements. And we use conditionals when we want to run a section of our code only when a certain condition is met. So here we have our standard starter code in open processing. So I'm just going to run this, and we can see that wherever the mouse goes, we're drawing a white ellipse. So we're going to add a conditional so that if our mouse is on the left-hand side of the screen, then the color is going to be one color, and if it's on the right-hand side, then the circle will be a different color. So our condition is going to be based on the location of the mouse, and the section of code that we're going to run is setting the fill. So we're going to start with our standard syntax for adding a conditional or an if statement. And so we write the word if followed by a set of parentheses. And then on the next two lines, we're going to put our opening and closing curly brackets. So we always start with this syntax when we're writing a conditional. And then the first thing we have to do is fill in these parentheses with the condition that we want to have met. So in this case, we're going to be looking at the position of our mouse on the screen. And in particular, we're going to be looking at its X position because we want to know if it's on the left or the right-hand side of our screen. So we have a special variable that tells us the X position of our mouse. It's called mouse X. And that's just built in, and it's automatically set to the location of our mouse. And there's also a mouse Y for its Y position. And we are going to be looking at that X position to see if it's on the left or the right-hand side. So to know that, I'm going to want to know the actual width and height of my window. So I'm going to change this to, we'll just do 800 by 500. So now I know my width is 800, so I've got 800 pixels, so the middle is going to be 400. So if my mouse X is less than 400, that means I'm somewhere in the 0 to 399 range, which means I'm on the left-hand side. So I'm going to go ahead and write this conditional statement. So if mouse X is less than 400, then the mouse is on the left-hand side. And if the mouse is on the left-hand side, then I'm going to set the fill. And we'll just go with red. So we're going to set our fill to red when it's on the left. And I could leave it like this, but it's not going to change color on the right. So I'll demonstrate this now. So I'm going to start out, and it's already red. And that's because the default position before I moved my mouse in to the actual canvas here is it actually started over here at 0, 0, just as a place to put my mouse until it moves into the canvas, and that is on the left-hand side. So, and of course it's not going to change back. We haven't set any other color, so even if I move it over to the right, it's not going to change. So in this case, we actually need to add a second part to our if statement here, and that's our else. And this isn't required for the syntax to be correct, but it's required in order to make our program do what we want in this case. So I'm going to add the else in here, and the else goes right below the closing curly bracket for the if. We don't need parentheses after the else. It's just going to automatically say, okay, if this condition was not true and we didn't set the fill to red, it's going to jump down here to the else, and it's going to run whatever we put between the curly brackets for our else. So in this case, we're going to again set the fill, and this time we'll do it to blue. So if our mouse X is less than 400, we're setting our fill to red. Otherwise, so if it's 400 or more, we're setting our fill to blue. So now I'm going to run that again. We can see it's red over here, and then we cross over that midpoint. This is where the 400 line is. So as soon as I cross over, we change the fill to be blue, and we can go back and forth and we start to really see that midline show up right here. This is the 400 line. So again, this else isn't required for the syntax to be correct, but a lot of times when you're writing if statements, you may want to include this else. All right, so now we're going to take a look at another example of a conditional, and this time we're going to be using the condition of whether or not the mouse is pressed. So the actual button on our mouse, we're going to be checking if that is pressed. And when it is pressed, we're going to be drawing with a rectangle, and when it's not pressed, we're going to draw with an ellipse. Right now, we're always drawing with this ellipse. So I'm going to add another conditional in here. So I'm going to set up my syntax for this, and I'm going to go ahead and add in my else because I know that I'm going to have one of two things happening. Either I'm drawing with an ellipse or with a rectangle. So I'm going to need both the if and the else. So now I'm going to go back up here, and in the parentheses for the if, I'm going to put my condition. And this time I'm going to use another special variable that's built in just like mouse X is. And this one is called mouse is pressed. And this is set to either true or false. So mouse X is a number because it's the X coordinate. Mouse is pressed is what we call a Boolean. It's a true or false value. So it's either true when the mouse button actually is pressed, or it's false when the button on the mouse is not pressed. So if the mouse is pressed, it's going to run whatever code I put in here between these two curly brackets. And I'm going to be drawing with a rectangle, so I'm going to use my rect function. And I'm going to draw it at the location of mouse X, mouse Y. And then if our mouse is not pressed, it's going to go down to the else and run the code that is in between these curly brackets. So I'm going to go ahead and move this ellipse code for drawing an ellipse where my mouse is. I'm going to move that inside these curly brackets so I only draw the ellipse when the mouse is not pressed. So now we've got our two conditionals, one looking at the X location of our mouse to set the fill, and the other looking at whether or not the mouse button is pressed. So I'm going to run this, and we can see I'm not pressing the mouse right now, so it's just doing the regular ellipse. And now I'm going to press the mouse button, and now we are drawing the rectangle, but not the ellipse. And then when I release, it switches back to the ellipse. So it's only ever running one of these sections. It never does both. So that's our syntax for conditionals. Remember, the else is optional, but it can be pretty useful sometimes. And we always need, inside these parentheses for the if, something that's either true or false. There's no maybes, there's no numbers, just true or false, so that it knows exactly whether or not it should run the code in the curly brackets or not.